Good evening, everyone, and you're very welcome to the second in our series of Let's Talk Sheep webinars. I'm Ciaran Lynch, and I'm going to be joined tonight by my colleague Philip Creighton. And with the grazing season kicking off, we're going to discuss various aspects of grassland management. Philip, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Ciaran.
And Philip, I suppose we're going to look at a quick recap of where we are at the moment, highlighting the importance of the opening covers, discussing a little bit about fertiliser management and some grazing advice indeed for the coming weeks and for the coming months.
Exactly, yeah.
Look, I would encourage any of the attendees, you can ask questions via the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. We're going to try and ask questions throughout, Philip. I believe we have a number of breaks during the presentation we'll be able to ask questions.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get my presentation up here now.
You're okay. And look at whatever we don't get around to asking during the presentation, we'll try and come back at the end and try and round up a few bits. So I would encourage you to use that Q&A tab, ask as many questions as you can during, and look, we'll try and endeavour to get to as many of them as we can. We might pair up some of them if needs be. So when Philip's just getting ready to start sharing, you get a preview of the slides as they're going to come up. Okay. So Philip, look, I'll let you start off tonight's webinar. I'll rejoin you again in a couple of moments when you get through the first section of it. So with that, Phil, I'll hand over to yourself.
Okay, thanks, Ciaran. So yeah, as Ciaran said, tonight we're going to focus on, I suppose, spring grassland management on sheep farms. Going to cover four main areas. Going to take a little look at grass supply out on farms now and what influences that. Going to cover a little bit about spring nitrogen in terms of boosting existing grass covers. Then we're going to go looking at the first grazing rotation and the things we need to look out for there to get the most from the grass in the first rotation, but also setting up the second rotation. And then we're going to look forward, into the second, third, fourth rotations, all the way to weaning, really, and what we need to be doing to maximise our grass production and quality, which obviously is all geared towards maximising our land performance. So with that, I suppose the first area we will look at is our spring grass supply. A couple of things that influence that. I suppose number one is, what did we do last autumn in terms of a closing plan? What has happened since? And in fairness, a lot of that is outside of our control. So winter grass growth rate highly influenced by the weather. And I don't need to tell anyone the sort of weather we've had really since Christmas. Then obviously there is an influence of getting fertilizer out on the swards. And then there's what we do in the next couple of weeks as we start grazing, which will have an impact on the supply of grass later into spring. Okay, so I suppose this is a good time for us to reflect, maybe, in terms of the best time to realise if we need to make changes on our farms is for as regards spring grass supply is now. And as I said, that's highly influenced by what we did last October, November, December. Okay, so this slide here basically is looking at the effect of closing date on spring grass supply in early March. The blue bars here represent the yield of grass in terms of kilograms of grass dry matter per hectare on a paddock on the first week of March, depending on when that field was closed in the autumn. And this is data that's coming from the farm here in Athenry, the Research Demonstration Farm, which is our Grassland Systems research farm for sheep. And this data has been collected over the last 6 or 7 years at this stage. And when we follow, when we close our paddocks in the autumn and then look at that the first week of March when we start lambing, what is the grass availability? And we can clearly see here that the paddocks that we start closing earlier have a higher grass cover. The paddocks that we close the latest, coming up to Christmas, have the lowest cover, and that's fine, because what we're trying to do here is close in rotation, and we'll graze that in rotation. So The paddocks that we want to graze this week, the ewes have started lambing here this week. We're turning sheep out now. Thankfully, the weather has improved, so we're able to do that. But they're going out to these paddocks that were closed on the 20th of October, and there's sufficient grass there for ewes to meet their demands. And as we move through the rotation, then the paddocks that were closed in early November will be next, then mid-November, then early December, and then late December. But those paddocks that do have a lower cover of grass on them at the moment aren't actually going to be required until early to mid-April for the end of the first rotation. So they still have additional time to grow grass. I suppose that's fine, but what do I mean by these covers? What do I mean by a cover of 900 or 1,000 kilograms of grass diameter per hectare? This here is a picture of one of the paddocks here in Athenry that I took yesterday when we were doing our grass cover. This is the first field that is being grazed now by ewes and lambs. It has a pre-grazing yield of just over 1,000 kilograms of grass diameter per hectare, or 7 centimeters, and was one of those fields that was closed in late October. Just in terms of, what does that mean? It's essentially 420 ewe grazing days. Now, I gave the previous example there where we said a 50 ewe flock. Off that, you'll get about 7 to 8 days worth of grazing. Okay, so everybody is going to have a different number of sheep. So that's just another way of expressing it. This here then is one of those paddocks that was closed later in the closing plan, closed mid-November. It currently has a cover of 650 kilograms of grass diameter per hectare, or around 5.5 centimeters of grass. And again, that then translates into about 260 ewe grazing days at a grass allowance of 2.5 kilograms of grass diameter per ewe per day. And finally, then we can see a paddock that wasn't closed until late December, the end of the rotation, only has a cover of 150 on it this week, or 4 centimeters. So essentially, really hasn't grown anything really much since it was closed in the autumn. And I suppose the reason I'm putting these up is just to highlight the impact in real visual terms, that if we leave everything till later in the autumn winter to close, we're going to have a lot of fields looking like this on the farm, and not a hell of a lot of grass there available for ewes. Okay, so I did say that, weather can have an effect then on overwinter growth, and it absolutely can. There's nothing we can do about the weather, unfortunately, and that's why it's even more important that we do everything we can with regard to the closing plan, because we have to, make an impact where we do have control, and then when we don't have control, at least, we've done everything in our power to try and negate some of the problems. And just to highlight, that last picture I showed you of the cover of 150 kilograms of grass diameter per hectare, that is lower than what I would have said in the earlier slides there. We would have expected a cover of about 300 on that at this stage. But just based on the data from here, and look at it, it's been no different around the rest of the country. We've had extremely high levels of rainfall, which doesn't help in terms of grass production. Soils were waterlogged. We also had a very cold January, so soil temperature well below normal, 26% below normal for Athenry, and I'm sure if we looked at other stations around the country, we'd see a similar pattern. So that has had an impact on grass supply as we stand here this week, and we would be behind target, and I suppose it's just something that we need to be aware of for our own farms, and we'll cover a little bit more of that as we move through. So in terms of what sort of opening farm cover do we need on a sheep farm, and how do we calculate it? And look, there's a good bit of text here and numbers. I don't want to make it overcomplicated, but just to give you a working example, if we took a farm that's stocked at 10 ewes per hectare, we want an opening farm cover of approximately 650 kilograms of grass diameter per hectare at the start of the grazing season, or the week that we start lambing. That's the equivalent of an average height across the farm, an average grass height of around 5.5 centimeters. And why is that? So if we were stocked at 10 ewes per hectare, as I said, each ewe, when they're turned out, or just post lambing, will have a daily demand of approximately 200 or 2.5 kilograms of grass dry matter per head per day. So you take your 10 euros per hectare, you multiply that by your 2.5, which gives you your daily requirement of 25 kilograms of grass dry matter per day. If we take our average farm cover of 650, divide that by 25, which is our daily demand, that gives us 26 days ahead. And that days ahead is a way that we express grass availability on sheep farms. It's another way of expressing the grass availability. We know from grass measuring that we can expect an average growth rate of about 15 kilograms of grass dry matter per hectare per day in early to mid-March. And this will add another 10 to 15 days worth of grass as we move through the first grazing rotation. So in reality, we will be playing with about 35 to 40 days worth of grass, which is the target for our first grazing rotation of about 40 days. So from early March to mid-April, so to mid-April, which is what we call Magic Day. Why do we aim for that? The period where growth conditions improve to the point where the amount of grass that we're growing every day matches the amount of grass that we actually require every day to feed the sheep, okay? So supply and demand are in balance, okay? So that's why we plan out that we can make that first grazing rotation last until we hit that point. And then we know that we're going to be in a position where we're going to have enough grass. You might say then, why don't I just target to have a higher cover? The reason for that is that we do need to make allowances that there will be a certain amount of grass growing every day that can be utilized. And I suppose another way of describing this is that the closing plan is there to bank up grass, to put grass into the bank, that we can take some of that every day while growth rates are still low, but also taking, utilizing the grass that is growing now as conditions improve. So some issues there that we could find ourselves in is that there would be insufficient area closed in the autumn to build covers for the spring, or, and this is a big one this spring, is that no nitrogen has been applied to boost covers and enhance March growth rates. And that's not something that was really within our control this year. So this is another one of the things that is totally weather dependent. And as I've shown, the amount of rainfall that we had meant that it was not appropriate to spread nitrogen really up until this week in a lot of areas, and maybe still not be appropriate in some areas depending on soil conditions. So that is having a negative effect also on grass availability. So I've just taken three examples now from commercial farms that are measuring on pasture-based Ireland. The green bar is Farm 1. Farm 1 is a highly stocked farm, stocked at about 12 euros per hectare. The lighter green farm is a farm that is stocked a lower stocking rate, about 8 euros per hectare, so it does have a lower demand. And the red bar there, or the orange bar, is a farm that's stocked at about 10 euros per hectare. And all of these farms are beginning to lamb kind of between this week and next week. So we'll have quite a high demand for grass. And you can see here the proportion of the farm that was closed at different periods there, from late October into mid-November, the end of November, and the middle of December. And there is a range there and a difference between those farms. And I suppose what I want to demonstrate is the effect that has had on the current average farm cover relative to what is required on those farms. So the blue bars here represent the requirement. So as I said, based on their stocking rate, they do have different requirements. Because Farm 1 is quite highly stocked, they have an opening farm cover requirement of 750 kilograms of grass dry matter per hectare. So higher than the 650 example that I gave earlier. Farm 2, because they're stocked at lower than that 10 euro per hectare, they're only stocked at 8 euros per hectare, only actually require an opening farm cover of around 500. And Farm 3, stocked at 10 euros per hectare, require that 600 to 650, okay? the reason that it's 600 here is that they're not actually lambing for another 10 days. They have some time. But as you can see, the closing pattern, or the percentage of the farm that they had closed at the different periods throughout October, November and December, has had a huge impact on where they stand today as regards meeting their requirements. Farm 1 implemented their closing plan pretty much exactly as required, and are bang on target, and actually have a slight surplus of grass available currently. Farm 2, a little bit behind, but within reason, are on target. But unfortunately, Farm 3, and just to highlight the fact that they had nothing closed at the end of October, had very little closed by mid-November, and it's that October-November period when there is still active grass growth that is really important for building grass covers for the spring. And if sufficient area is not closed in that period, this is the result. Now, part of the reason obviously is the weather conditions. That farm is based in the west of Ireland, where the rainfall levels have been quite high, and similar to what we've seen for Athenry here. Soil temperatures were quite cool as well. But look, even taking that into account, things that were within their control has had an impact on grass availability today relative to where it could have been. Okay, so it's just highlighting the effect that can have on grass availability now. And it's important that we reflect on our own circumstances in terms of what we did. And if we are tight on grass at the moment, is there things that we could change for next year?
Okay, Philip, we might just pause you there for a second, and look, I'd encourage our attendees to use the Q&A tab to ask any questions, and we've some coming in on it. Just maybe, Phil, to kick you off, there's probably 2 points there. One, you touched on it there at the very end, actually making an assessment of what the opening covers on the farm, whether it be in accrued terms or how many days grazing ahead we have at this stage. It's no harm to kind of put in perspective what impact did closing have on an open cover on an individual farm.
Yeah, so like, I think these examples here very clearly show that, where a plan was put in place and stuck to, particularly, as I said, that first 40% for October and November, has had a clear impact here on what the current grass availability is on those farms versus a farm that didn't really have much of the farm closed at all until mid to late November, and missed that kind of earlier window there where grass growth was still active, and especially considering that conditions got deteriorated so much then from Christmas onwards. It is showing an impact here now.
I think it's a very useful example in that, but like it probably highlights the fact semi-independent of stocking rate, like that first 20% in October. Okay, we can argue for the higher stock farms, it should be slightly higher, but your first 40%, so between October to mid-November, independent of stocking rate, that's really key for any farm. And I suppose the reality is what we do with the latter 6% is more really dependent on, how much you're going to graze out and what your stock rate is and your demand is as you progress. But even for lower stock farms, is there a fair argument there, Philip, they should be closing up a portion of the ground that they depend on the spring earlier?
Yes, absolutely, and your point is very valid, Ciaran. If you're a more lowly stocked farm, your demand for grass in the spring will be lower. So if the later stages of that closing plan extend a little bit later into November, December, that's okay because you have extra time to build. But if you're a highly stocked farm, you really have to be starting early and sticking to quite large areas of the farm being closed as early as possible, really.
And there's a question in from Patrick there, and it's a relevant one. Like for farmers that will be carrying stock out and maybe lambing outdoors in April, how much ground can you close early, or how do you manage that? And maybe there's an argument in some of them cases for that latter 60% of building higher covers on them earlier, maybe starting in September on.
Yeah, and it's a very good question. Look, there's a lot of different systems out there, and not everybody is going to be housing the entire flock or be able to remove sheep from the entire farm. What we would say is to try and close as much of the farm as possible. In an ideal scenario, even up to 80% of the farm closed by December, mid-December. And if you could confine the sheep to a smaller area, that last 20%, supplement them on that area of the farm, be it with hay, silage, concentrates, whatever it is, and give as much of the farm as possible a chance to grow. And that last 20% then, will be targeted for the very end of the grazing rotation now in the spring. And depending on when you're lambing, we'll have a period in March and April to build cover again before it's required.
And look, obviously, it's the first products we're closing, it's them sheltery products, so depend on. Just again, like using that example, you give them 3 fields and the covers is on them. Even in a winter like we've had this year, like we've seen good springs, so we had great growth, but in a difficult winter, which can happen as it did this year, that's really the buffer we have at Turnout now till growth rates pick up again. Yeah.
I mean, look, it's while grass covers in a lot of circumstances this spring are behind. 2 factors behind it really is the weather conditions since Christmas and the fact we weren't able to get nitrogen out to boost those covers when they were, the covers that had been built from the earlier closings. But at least there is grass there, versus if we don't put a closing plan in place, there won't be grass. We can guarantee that there won't be grass if we haven't put a plan in place. So it's about doing everything that we can and then reacting to the circumstances as they evolve.
There's a question in here from Sean. I think it more really ties into your next section. Like, the better covers of grass at the moment, are they more responsive to that spring nitrogen as opposed to bare ones? Of course they are, but yeah, that's the other kick on you get.
Yeah, and that's the other point of it too, is that when they're closed in sequence like that, you do have a cover there that is able to grow and will respond. It has leaf there to capture light. The days are getting longer, and it will respond very much to an application. And absolutely, we will move into that section now, I suppose, if there isn't any other.
The adage of grass goes grass. Philip, I'll let you on. I'll join you again at the end of this bit.
Perfect, yeah. So I suppose the thing about it then is that once we've built our grass covers, as part of our closing plan, one of the things then, I suppose grass basically needs heat or an increase in soil temperature. It needs moisture, which definitely isn't in short supply this year. And then it needs nitrogen, okay, to boost that growth rate. And the decisions around that, or when to apply, is based around what is our requirement. So what is our stocking rate, as we've covered there, what is our demand, and how much grass do we actually need, and then we can make decisions based on that. But absolutely, we can't apply any nitrogen until the conditions are right. So soil temperature is one, soil moisture is another, and those haven't been ideal really until very recently, in the vast majority of cases. And then we need to make a decision around what our product is, and how much to apply. I suppose just to bring it back to why would we bother applying early nitrogen, what is the benefits of it? If we look at it from a cost point of view, our average response to nitrogen applied is that for every 1 kilogram of nitrogen that we apply, we can grow up to 10 kilograms of grass dry matter per kilogram of nitrogen applied. Okay, that in terms of cost, if we take protected urea, which would be the product of choice for this time of year, at €400 a ton, that's going to cost us 87 cents per kilogram of nitrogen applied. And in terms of per kilogram of grass dry matter grown, then that will cost us 8.7 cents. Okay, what's the alternative? The alternative is that we don't have grass, or we have very little grass, and we're going to have to supplement the O's with concentrates at some level of grass, or perhaps very little grass. And the less grass we have, the more concentrates we're going to have to feed. I've just priced that there in terms of if we take concentrates at €330 a ton, that's going to cost us 33 cents a kilo fresh, or 38 cent a kilogram per kilogram of dry matter, and because concentrates are going to be about 87% dry matter typically. A yaw, so 10 kilograms, the response that we would have got from the 1 kilogram of nitrogen to grow the 10 kilograms of grass, that would feed 4 yaws feed 1 yaw for 4 days in early lactation, 2.5 kilograms of dry matter per yaw per day, as we said. So to feed 10 kilograms of concentrates would cost us €3.80, which will be 4 times the cost of graze grass. Now, I know in reality, we're not going to feed an all concentrate diet, but even if we were having to supplement half the diet with concentrates post lambing, that's going to, be twice as more costly to feed the yaw compared to a mainly grass diet. So again, it's trying to do everything we can to ensure as much grass as possible to meet that demand. But we do have to consider the following points. Number one, as I've said, is what is the soil temperature, and it needs to be a minimum of 6 degrees and rising to be able to take up that nitrogen and to grow. What are ground conditions? And again, this has been the real limiting factor for us this spring, is that we cannot spread on wet soils. It's going to lead to nitrogen loss and soil damage. So we have to wait for those soils to dry out. Thankfully, in a good portion of the country this week, we have had that opportunity. It hasn't happened everywhere, and we do acknowledge that. And unfortunately, people are just going to have to wait until those soils do become trafficable. But what I would urge people to do is to walk the farm and just make sure that while all the farm may not be suitable, there may be parts of the farm which has drained, and we would be able to get some nitrogen on to boost grass covers. So it's not really a spring for blanket spreading. Maybe it's a spring for spreading where we can, when we can. Is grass actively growing? And that comes back to, I think it was Patrick's question around, these covers that have been built up, surely they are going to be more responsive. Absolutely they are. Swards that have a higher perennial ryegrass content, or swards that have built a grass cover that is greater than 400 kilograms of grass diameter per hectare, or 5 centimeters, are going to be more responsive. If we have swards which have lower covers, or down that very low covers of 4 centimeters, whatever that I showed in the earlier pictures, they would probably benefit more from an application of farmyard manure or slurry if it was available. There may be something else going on there more than just that it was closed late. There could be soil fertility issues there, and would benefit from that. Obviously, the best thing to do there will be to take soil samples and know for sure, and identify those fields that aren't responding, and take action. How much to apply then is the final question. And I suppose that's very dependent on what your actual feed demand is, or your stocking rate is. What we would say is not to apply more than 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, or 24 units to the acre in any one application. There is a little bit of talk at the moment that because people have been delayed in getting out with nitrogen, that they're going to go with higher rates. I wouldn't advise that, mainly for the reason that the grass plant only has a certain potential to take up nitrogen at any one time. We can spread extra nitrogen if we want, but it greatly increases the risk of leaching, of loss, and because the plant isn't going to be able to take that up fast enough. And we really can't be going down that road. It's irresponsible, and it's also extremely costly. And with the price of it now, we can't afford to be doing that. So for more lowly stocked farms, we're kind of saying 17-20 units the acre, 20 kilograms per hectare for farm stock, less than 10 euros per hectare maybe. And then for higher stock farms, up to or even higher than 12 euros per hectare, we can go with that kind of 24 units the acre, or 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for the first application. So that's kind of the second area there that we wanted to cover in terms of spring fertilizer application.
Okay, I'll let you catch your breath there for a second. So again, I encourage our panelists to ask any question in Q&A. We have a couple in relation to fertilizer, Philip. Maybe just to kick it off, like there's a question here, and you kind of cover this about applying protected urea. It's in from John on paddocks with very low covers, so something like 250 kilos. Is it better to apply it now, or should they wait till there's better covers?
Yeah, I'd be kind of saying wait for the covers to increase a bit. The main limiting factor, I suppose, up to now has been that soils have been quite waterlogged in many cases, and soils have been quite cold. Where a cover of grass has, built up, that's obviously a freer draining soil or field, possibly is at a better soil fertility level, and will respond, whereas fields that are bare, have very low grass covers, are going to be slower to respond. And I think it would be a better option, again, as I said, if there was some organic manures available on the farm that could be utilised to boost that now, or as the soil dries out now and warms up, grass cover will start to increase itself and then boost it with nitrogen as it improves.
So potentially in them paddocks, if they're certainly not in the first part of the rotation, you could follow up later on. And again, as you indicate there, could be PE issues or other issues with them.
Could be it's a great time now to do soil tests now before you do actually go out and spread any fertilizer if you haven't spread any already, because it'll form the plan for the year ahead.
Just sticking with the covers one, going with nitrogen on better covers, like we're talking 800 kilos plus, will it help maintain active growth if we get a cold snap in the middle of March, as we frequently see?
It can, yes. And again, that's a question that some people will ask. Well, I have a field here. It has a good cover grass on it. It's kind of at the optimum in terms of pre-grazing yield at the moment. Will I skip that, graze it now and then apply? I would say no. Apply as normal, because really that fertilizer you're spreading now is the fertilizer that's going to grow the grass for the second rotation. So as that's grazed off, the plant needs that nitrogen to maximize its growth for the next rotation. So yes, if weather gets that little bit colder, but as days are getting longer now, hopefully we won't be getting prolonged cold spells. But yeah, if it gets into the plant, it may help in some ways to keep it that little bit more active. But I think the main reason.
I think that's something we've seen a couple of years ago where we had better spring growth. Look, we've seen a lot of very high open covers on farms, and there was a reluctance maybe to put fertilizer on them. The challenge was that they tended to lag and were slower response in that second rotation heading into early April, and caused a bit of a deficit at that point.
Yeah, and I suppose, look, at no matter what we do on a sheep farm, we're always going to be tight for grass kind of early April, because demand is rising so fast, and growth rate maybe isn't quite there yet. As we said, it's usually the middle of April before that really kicks in. So anything that we can do to try and ensure that we're not limiting growth at that period, really we need to keep in our minds.
And just before you move off to fertilizer one, we have a question here from Seamus, and I suppose it's relevant considering the fact that fertilizer application has been delayed this spring, and we might be looking at split applications. He's wondering how long after spreading in early March will it take to get a response from it?
Yeah, it all depends really on the conditions. So I suppose for the fertilizer to actually react, get into the soil and get into the plant, can take 7 to 10 days. But again, it does depend on what the conditions are like. So if we get prolonged rising temperatures, not a whole lot of rainfall, that will happen quite quickly. If temperatures were to fluctuate a little bit, or we did get some rainfall again, it may be a little bit longer. But the point is that we're not going applying the fertilizer until the conditions are right, and we're maximizing then the opportunity for that to work as quickly as it can. But no, it won't be immediate, but it will be in the relatively short term.
I think your point you already made, like it's a case of targeting them dry areas and farms that haven't got out with it already.
Yes.
Okay. Look, I know it's something you're going to come back to again in terms of second rotation application. I might just let you back, Philip, in terms of, look, we've discussed open cover, we've covered the fertilizer. I suppose the next key focus is, well, how are we going to manage this grass? So I'll let you back to your presentation.
Yep, thanks, Ciaran. So yeah, as you said, the aim then is a scene like this, where we have ewes and lambs turned out, and that's actually the same paddock. Now it's not this week; it's taken this time last year. Blue skies, green grass. That's what we're looking for. And I suppose the question then is, how do we best manage that grass in the first rotation, to feed the ewe, which is going to feed the lamb, and have enough grass coming back for the second rotation when the lamb is going to start eating grass as well. So grass demand is going to rise rapidly now over the next couple of weeks to a month. And we need to do everything we can to ensure that not alone do we feed them now to the best of our ability, but that we don't leave ourselves short in 4 or 5 weeks' time, when the ewes are at peak lactation and lambs are now actually starting to graze grass as well. So one way that we can do that is the whole idea of managing our first rotation, to actually get a grazing rotation going. So I suppose the temptation is that we turn ewes and lambs out in small groups, and that makes perfect sense from a management point of view. You want to make sure that ewes and lambs are mothering up, and that you're able to keep a close eye on younger lambs for any issues, and that's the correct thing to do. But at the same time, while not doing anything that would have a negative effect on the ewe or the lamb, we need to try and put a plan in place that ensures that we can group up sheep as quickly as is practical, or as quickly as we can do safely, to get a rotation going. Because the issue is that if we turn out ewes and lambs to every field on the farm, they're all grazing down those fields at the same time, and there's no opportunity for grass to grow to its optimum, in terms of taking advantage of the rising temperatures, the fertilizer kicking in, the longer day length, etc. So just an example that we use here on the farm in Athenry, and it is, I suppose, that for this plan is based on for every group of sheep that you intend to run. So in the longer term, if you plan on running 2 groups of sheep on the farm until weaning, you would need to have 10 grazing divisions. It's based on 5 grazing divisions per group of sheep that you're going to manage on the farm. Okay. How it works is that it's the reverse of the autumn closing plan, really, in that it's when the sheep start lambing, the first half of the ewes that lamb are turned out to paddock 1. Once we get halfway through, the second half of the ewes, we stop turning them into paddock 1, we start turning them into paddock 2, which means that we have 2 groups of sheep. From a management point of view, it also means that the sheep that are in paddock 1 are the older lambs. They're kind of a week or 2 weeks old by the time we start turning sheep into paddock 2, which means that the critical period where you're really worried about mothering up and weaker lambs or whatever, that kind of has passed, and we can concentrate more time on paddock 2 because they're the youngest lambs that are freshly turned out, so we can better prioritize our time. But also it means then that when it comes to the sheep in paddock 1 have made their way through that paddock, grazed all the grass off it. So the field there that we saw that had a cover of 1,000 kilos, 7 centimeters, because it's a smaller group of sheep, it's going to last them that little bit longer, and the plan, it's a little bit different to maybe what some people would talk about on the dairy side or the beef side, where you'd start in lower covers of grass to retrain the animal to grazing. That would be the optimal from a grass point of view, but what we're trying to do here is get the balance between what's good for the animal and what's good for the grass. And we don't want to be moving ewes and very young lambs too quickly, because of mismothering, because of potential injuries to lambs moving through gateways and stuff. So we're targeting that they'll get about 2 weeks off that first field. Okay, at that stage the lambs are 2 weeks old, 2 to 3 weeks old, and it can then be moved either into paddock 2 to finish that off, depending on what sort of cover is there, or go straight to paddock 3 with the sheep from paddock 2, okay? And at that point, we have a rotation going. But the key thing is that by around St. Patrick's Day or just after it, the sheep that were turned out to paddock 1 are gone off that, and it's growing again, okay? And if we look at the plan here, it basically then has a month to grow a sufficient amount of grass again so that it's ready for the first grazing in rotation 2, okay? So it has that 4 weeks to grow grass so that we have sufficient grass there to start the second rotation. And the importance of that is that, as I said, the feed demand, the daily feed demand is increasing all the time. The ewes demand is increasing. The lambs demand is starting to increase now as well. And we'll come to a slide in a little while where we'll show that. But that's the principle of getting a rotation going. If we were to just leave sheep across the entire farm, we may get away with it on a good spring when growth is very strong. But in a spring where we're starting from a low base already, you know, we could run ourselves into trouble very fast, and that we'd be okay for grass now and even for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but then there'll be nothing coming behind us. And that's when the pinch point comes. And that's a common problem on sheep farms, is that the pinch point doesn't necessarily come now. It comes that first or second week of April. And that has a knock-on effect then right through to weaning, really, because the ewe is getting restricted at that stage. She's not milking as well as she could. The grass isn't available there for the lambs, and they get a growth check. And once they're checked at that point, it's very hard to get them back up to where they should be again. So it's just something to try and work on. You know, as we say, trying to get the balance there between absolutely doing everything we can for the sheep and what's best for them, but also trying to do as much as we can for what's best for the grass. That first rotation, as we said earlier, should be around that 40 days, 20% graze by mid-March to allow the regrowths for the first, for the start of the second rotation. 40% by the end of March, which again is going to be the next paddock that's going to be grazed, you know, so kind of the end of April. Combining the groups, as I said, it allows for faster regrowths on the paddocks to meet the grand demand in the second rotation. And I suppose, as the old saying goes, it takes grass to grow grass. And that's the importance of it. And I suppose at that point then, you know, we're talking about reviewing what we need to spread again in terms of fertilizer. We would be kind of saying that more nitrogen will be needed to boost grass covers into the second and third rotation. And after that then, decisions around fertilizer for the rest of the year can be made depending on your feed demand or your stocking rate. That's also a point in time there where, you know, if there's issues identified around soil fertility or whatever, it's a good time maybe to be coming in with a compound fertilizer to be boosting soil fertility as we move into the main part of the grazing season to optimize grass growth as well. That's a quick run through the first rotation, Ciaran.
Okay, so we have some questions in on that, Philip. Look, I suppose the first one came in on it is from Shane, and he's asking, you know, he's a good opening cover. If he's not getting through all them paddocks by the end of that first rotation, start of April, should he skip across them, or should he continue to graze them, or does that knock him out of sync for the second rotation?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I suppose there's a couple of ways to look at this. Depending on what way grass is growing, if he's getting to early April and he's still only in paddock 3, for example, it could mean that he has a higher coverage of grass ahead of him than maybe he can get through in a period of time, and that can happen when we get a growth spurt. But at least we have options when we have that. It'll all depend on what's coming back on the first paddock. So we still need a situation where, you know, we're getting up to that 900 or 1,000 really minimum on the first paddock again, or else we can start the second rotation, but we could get tight on grass very quickly again. So where this actually comes into its own a little bit better is for somebody who's not grass measuring. If they're moving through that much quicker, it means that maybe the grass covers are lower than they need. They're moving through the farm very fast. And it will be an alarm bell for me to say, look, we need to slow this rotation down, put in some supplement to allow the grass a chance to grow behind us so that we have it in front of us in a month's time.
And that probably just ties in with probably the opposite of that scenario at the moment for farms that they go out to a lower opening cover, maybe were late for fertilizer and find themselves behind, like your earlier example of Farm 3.
Yeah.
Get in with supplementation early as opposed to running out of grass.
Get it in early.
When you've got turned
it's much better to keep a level of grass in the diet and supplement it and stretch what you have available than to graze everything that you have in a short space of time, run out of grass completely. The entire farm is stripped bare, and then, as we said, grass grows grass. If you have no grass, it'll actually be even slower to start growing again. And you're in a fairly bad position for a prolonged period versus even back a few years ago, spring of 2013, maybe we had a very, very long, cold, zero growth spring. Basically, what we did was we supplemented from day one, stretched out what we had, and I think it was near the end of April before things improved. But once things started to improve, grass covers responded very quickly because the whole farm wasn't at the same level. It was in different stages. So it's just as important.
And just like when you are on that one, I think it's useful again, like to highlight the need to get that grouping up early done. You can see from your Paddock 3 on, you have a bit more grazing pressure to actually achieve them residuals and keep sheep moving out. Look, we see the other issue of pastures getting dirty, and there's a question in there about achieving that residual. You want pastures to get dirty, they're going to spend for a long time on them. So getting the numbers built up earlier in that rotation really sets it up.
Yeah, and I suppose we'll come to it in a second, but at that stage, if conditions are challenging, it may be a case of having to maybe put in some extra subdivisions, take what you can from it. But if it's getting very dirty, you're going to have no choice but to move them on. But if you're moving them on because a big area has got dirty and they won't eat it or can't eat it, then it's a lot of grass, potential grass that you've had to skip over versus a smaller area. While the top of the ground may be dirty, you'll utilize as much as you can, move on. A couple of days rain, it's clean again and it's growing, and you have a chance. Whereas if you have big areas of the farm and poor conditions, utilization will be poor, no question about it. But it can have the same effect here, in that you'll have very little grass available for grazing then very quickly.
It could put you under a lot of pressure, Nick. But look, Philip, I'm just conscious of time, so I'll let you back to it. We'll come back to it. I see a few more questions in our area. I'll try and take them within, so I'll let you continue on.
Yeah, so really, we won't be too long on this section anyway, but this is really just then from the second rotation onwards. We're talking about the aim is to maintain high animal performance from a grass-only diet. That's targeting pre-grazing covers of I suppose between 11 and 1300, so around that 7 or 8 centimeter mark. Moving the sheep frequently. So again, if you have your 5 paddock system, they'll be moving every 5 days or so. Ideally, subdividing that to be moving them every 2.5 days, 2 to 3 days, I suppose. The reason for that is that you're keeping fresh grass in front of them all the time. It's easier to utilize it. It's maximizing the regrowth behind you. Grazing down to about 4.5 centimeters. I suppose I should have said for the first rotation, we're going to about 3.5 centimeters to clean out any dead material or that was built up over winter. For the majority of flocks, a post-grazing height of 4.5 would be the aim for the mid-season or the main season up to weaning. If you're more highly stocked, you may have to go down to 4 centimeters, but for the vast majority of people, around 4.5 centimeters would be the optimum. What does that look like? Pre-grazing yield wise, that's what 7.5 centimeters looks like on the left, and the upper end of the pre-grazing target of about 9 centimeters there on the right hand side. But we don't really want to be grazing any higher than that because you're going to get more stem and lower performance. What does 3.5 centimeters look like? That's kind of what we're targeting for the first rotation. and then 4.5 centimeters on your right hand side, which is your kind of main season residual target. How, you know, the importance of having paddocks or some sort of divisions on the farm really can't be over stressed, because that's what's going to dictate the grass quality, the grass utilization, and the grass production. To have good lamb performance from grass, we need a high proportion of leaf. That's where the energy is, that's where the digestibility is, and we need to have some sort of control to be able to achieve that, and the paddock system is that. As I said, the aim is basically a minimum of 5 grazing divisions per grazing group. So again, if you're going to run 2 groups, you need to have 10 divisions. Okay, you need to have 5 divisions per group. An example: 100 ewe flock stocked at 10 ewes per hectare, 5 grazing divisions at 2 hectares each, or 5 acres each. Ideally, those 5 grazing divisions could be permanently fenced, and then the option to subdivide each of those temporarily again into 10 temporary divisions, which gives you your more frequent movements, which gives you your higher quality grass much more regularly going into the lamb, and also means that the utilization will be easier. And if we get those poor weather periods where very heavy rain or whatever, you can move on, and you're only, you know, having to move on from a smaller area into a fresh area again. Not going to go into huge detail now, but the reason for the 2 hectares or the 5 acres, I suppose, is if the aim is around 1,200 kilograms of grass dry matter per hectare is the pre-grazing yield, 7 to 8 centimeters. Your 100 ewes, between the ewes and the lambs at that stage, are going to be eating about 4 kilos a day in terms of dry matter per ewe and lamb units, or ewe and our lambs. 1,200 kilos of dry matter per hectare divided by the 400 will give you 3 days grass in 1 hectare. So your 2 hectare paddock will be 6 days. So again, obviously, if you can subdivide it, you're offering the ideal amount for about 3 days at a time. Obviously, you know, a lot of fencing, permanent fencing, is going to be expensive. And what we're saying is that have permanent fencing where it's required or strategically around the farm, and then subdivide that with temporary electric fencing, which is going to be a lot more cost effective and is very effective. Once the sheep are trained to the fence, and there's absolutely no issues with it. And we do have a video on our Teagasc YouTube channel, electric fencing for sheep. If you want to watch it, it goes through how to set up the fence, number of strands required at different, you know, to train lambs, and how to, the whole process basically. So if you want to check that out, it's on the Teagasc YouTube channel. I suppose finally then, just coming back to wrapping things up in terms of from lambing from now until weaning. Again, this just illustrates how grass demand increases rapidly from lambing as the ewe reaches peak lactation. The blue line there is the ewe demand, the green line at the bottom is lamb demand, and the red line at the top is total demand between the ewe and the lambs. Okay, so you can see that demand rises rapidly and stays very high, you know, as we move into week 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 of post lambing. And it's worth bearing in mind then that there will come a point where the lamb's requirement is continuing to increase. The ewe's requirement is decreasing because her milk production potential is dropping. And there will come a point where we should wean the lambs, prioritize the good grass to them, and then, you know, the ewes can be used as a management aid, really, in terms of lambs can graze out, you know, from your 7 or 8 centimeters down to maybe around 6 centimeters, and the ewes from 6 down to 4. The lambs get access to the very best, and the ewes get access to a maintenance diet, which is all they need at that point. Finally, I suppose I have talked a lot tonight about kgs of dry matter per hectare. I suppose for those of you that are interested, grass measuring and budgeting can add an awful lot to managing grass on a sheep farm. It's not just for dairy farmers. There's huge amounts of benefits to doing it on a sheep farm. It's not that complicated. It's not that expensive. Even as simple as your sward stick there, that we've seen in some of the photos there as well. And if you want one of them, contact your local office or contact ourselves, and we'll try and get one out to you. An example of why it's so beneficial, and it really ties us back to the start again. Having data for your own farm, specific to your own farm, is so valuable in terms of making decisions for your farm. We can give the best advice we can, but there's nothing like having data for your own farm that you can come to us with and say, well, this is what my growth rate is, this is what my demand is, what do you think I should do? Rather than us trying to prescribe stuff when we don't have a whole lot to work on. And this is just an example that if you could build up over a number of years the kind of grass production on your farm, it's much easier then to tailor. But actually, do you know what? Maybe I'm lambing too early. You know, I'm consistently having a problem with grass supply in the spring. My farm is maybe a later growing farm, whether that's to do with location, soil type, rainfall, whatever it is. And having that information, then we can make tailored decisions. And it's just one example, but it's an example I think that is relevant. And it's a relevant question for all of us. I think that if we're consistently having a problem there, maybe we're just lambing too early, and by adjusting our lambing date a little bit, maybe we can get around some of the problems. I suppose for people that are interested maybe in grass measuring, we've done a lot of work over the last number of years, developing more better information, better advice around grassland targets for sheep farms. If you want to look at Pasture Base Ireland, it's an online management resource there run by Teagasc, and we've loaded a lot of information into the background now, that if you're willing to put in your stock numbers, the number of sheep you have, your lambing date, and just the covers of grass off your farm, it'll give you all the calculations for you and give you advice on what steps to take. So a lot of the work has been taken out of it at this stage. It's just, you know, you need to commit to putting the data in, but other than that, it's there. So just to wrap up then, the key points, I suppose: assess your current grass supply now, reflect on maybe what could be done differently for next year, leaving aside the weather conditions that we had. Take action early if required. So, you know, look, if we are short on grass, take action early, stretch what you have, don't wait for it to run out. Make a plan for your first rotation to try and maximize the regrowth to make sure that we have enough grass, you know, as demand increases. And then for the rest of the period up to weaning, follow your pre and post grazing targets. It will result in improved grass quality and improved land performance. Okay, so thanks very much, and we'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Philip. And look, you stuck very well the time, and I'm conscious we are approaching an hour, but I've just a couple of quick questions maybe to go back to you with. Firstly, just there's a few fertilizer related questions. For farmers maybe spread 2,500 gallons of slurry, we say late March or late February, early March. Is there a need to go back on nitrogen, and how would you go back on nitrogen on them paddocks?
Yeah, so I suppose if slurry has been spread recently, you're probably okay in terms of your nitrogen requirement for the moment, because, well, depending on what way you've put it out, you're probably talking probably 15 to 20 units have been supplied there through that slurry. If that has been targeted to lower covers, as we suggested, that was, you know, the right thing to do. It will boost grass supply now, and that will probably be topped up with nitrogen towards the end of March. If it hasn't been applied to heavier covers, I would be trying to get nitrogen onto those heavier covers as soon as it's practical.
And just staying on the fertilizer one, we won from John Joe, a farmer would have applied superphosphate in late February. How soon would he go with nitrogen on that?
Yeah, again, look at it. He can go with nitrogen once the conditions are appropriate. The superphosphate was there to correct the P deficit, and that is important for spring grass. You know, if P and K is out of zinc, but yeah, you need to be getting the nitrogen out to get the response from the grass.
Okay, and just moving it forward slightly, I have a question from Mark about how soon would you set up your temporary divisions? And I might just get you, when you explain that one, Philip, to maybe just go through what residency period is and its implication for both grass performance really and land performance.
Yeah, So how soon? Usually what we do is we start setting them up from the beginning of the second rotation. Now, having said that, we have done it in the first rotation in the past, as I said, when we were tight on grass in years. We've set it up really from when the lambs were about 2 weeks old. The reason for that is to try and ration out the grass that we do have. And if we were supplementing or something, we try and give them a certain amount of grass, a certain amount of supplement. There's no issue with putting the fences up early. It's just an extra job maybe when you're still lambing, which is something that we try to avoid. But I suppose the key thing is to set the fence up to suit young lambs. So you will need to put in additional strands. We would normally go with 4 strands of polywire, 2 strands very close together at the bottom. Then your middle one is normal, and then your top one. And that's to ensure that lambs don't try and get through the fence, because what we found is that if lambs get through the fence on their initial experience of it, they kind of get used to it and they'll try the fence the whole time. Whereas if the fence is put up in such a way that they don't go through it when they're being trained to it, they'll respect it for the rest of the period.
Or to get them trained, and certainly have good power supply when you put them up initially.
Yeah, and I suppose the advantages of that is that the sooner you can get your rotation going, and you're able to control the utilization of the grass. If it's a case that we need to slow the rotation down, it has advantages. But also, even on a normal year, as we say, we started from the beginning of the second rotation, it just maximizes the regrowth. So it maximizes the utilization over a short period of time. The sheep are moving into fresh grass more frequently, which helps in milk production in the ewe, and also maintains the quality of the grass for when the lambs start grazing as well. And it maximizes the regrowth, because the grass, instead of the sheep being in the paddock constantly nipping at the new shoots, the new leaves, they're gone off that already. So when the new leaf appears, it has the potential to go up through the stages and fully express itself and grow. So you're going to have grass back quicker than if the sheep were set stocked or on that paddock for a prolonged period of time.
Okay, I'm just conscious we're approaching now, but just maybe one final point. There was a question on it again, like the whole issue around lambing date. I think when your grass are then displayed well, like if you start off with a poor opener cover, you really are struggling. You have that direct cost, Philip, in terms of having to supplement, but probably the hidden cost in some of them systems is that knock-on effect on your performance, on lamb performance, and there's a labour element to it too. Would it be fair to say, like, we probably have short memories in farming, but it's kind of make a conscious decision now, is this working for me or should I go later?
Yeah, I suppose short memories, if we had good memories, we probably wouldn't be sheep farming, considering the time of year we're in now, and you're stuck in a lambing shed until all hours. But like, it's the same thing with the closing plant. We have a short memory in that, we've no grass this time of year, and then it comes to next autumn and we say, we'll just do what we always did, and then we're back to square one again with no grass again next spring. So it's a case of, we have to sit back and say, right, what is causing this? And if the case is look, no matter what we do, this farm just is not capable of growing grass until the middle of March or the end of March, and we're consistently lambing the end of February or the beginning of March, then we have to do something to adjust that, and that could be lambing date. Is one of those things that we could look at.
Okay. Look, Philip, thank you very much for tonight. I think you covered a lot of aspects of it. I would like to thank those our panelists or our participants who attended, particularly those who asked questions. I'm sorry for those who we didn't get around to. There was a few coming in there at the tail end. I hope we covered most of it. This recording will be available on the Teagasc website next week. So with that, I'm going to finish things up. Philip, thanks very much. We hope to see you all back now. We hope to see you all back in early April for next episode of Let's Talk Sheep, and in that we're going to focus on parasite control in early lambs around that time of the year. So good night to everybody, all the best with lambing, and we hope to see you back in a month's time. Thanks again.
Thank you.